Part 3, Battered by Recession, Restructuring and Reaction, 1974 to 1981. Chapter 9, The Momentum is Broken. The new communist movement reached its peak in terms of initiative, though not yet absolute numbers or organizational sophistication, in 1973 to 1974. In just 5 years it had grown into a potent force encompassing several nationwide organizations, dozens of local groups, and the left's largest circulation newspaper. New groups were continuing to form and existing ones were attracting a steady stream of new recruits. Progress had been made at implanting cadre within the working class. Prospects seemed good for uniting the majority of movement adherents into a single party, but over the next 7 or 8 years this project stalled, fragmented, and spiraled downhill. This decline was fundamentally driven by deep-going structural changes that battered and divided the social sectors on which the new communist movement had pinned its strategy. Recession and then economic restructuring following the end of the long post-war boom decimated the clout and combativity of young black workers and other young workers, many of them Vietnam vets, by a deindustrialization of entire urban areas and where plants remained, layoffs of low-seniority employees. Yet it was these workers who had spearheaded the rank-and-file insurgencies of 1969 to 1973, which, along with the study of classic texts and examples of worker militancy in France or Italy, had convinced so many 60s radicals to embrace Marxism-Leninism. The opening was thus closed off for party builders to gain a substantial mass base, and the entire U.S. labor movement was thrown on the defensive. This same economic downturn and assault, along with racial backlash political mobilizations, checked the motion toward equality and empowerment in all U.S. communities of color, where the new communist movement had also concentrated its cadre and its hopes. The end of draft calls and Washington's decision to pursue counter-revolutionary wars via proxy armies rather than U.S. troops removed one of the main rallying points for student and youth activism, which had supplied so many Marxist recruits, and the breakup of the World Anti-Imperialist Front that had supported the Vietnamese Revolution, a casualty of the new stage in the Sino-Soviet split, and Washington's skillful exploitation of it, disoriented and demoralized the peace, any intervention and anti-imperialist constituencies that had held considerable initiative in the early 1970s. Further, galvanized by fears of rampant inflation, falling property values, and the like, as well as by racism, the country's large white and suburban middle strata began to mobilize and to ally with those sectors of capital, promoting the first stages of what is now termed neoliberalism, privatization, subsidies to entrepreneurship, tax breaks for the better off, cutbacks in social programs, anti-union policies, and so on. The new right-led coalition that would bring Ronald Reagan to the White House took shape while the old New Deal coalition essentially broke up. The key sectors into which the new communist movement had just begun to sink roots were thus knocked back on their heels, their economic base undermined, their political strength eroded, and their prospects for gaining nationwide initiative all but completely foreclosed. Of course, new communist cadre did not understand things this way at the time, neither did their class and political opponents. The restructuring of the 1970s was not the result of a small group conspiracy or grand plan, but the cumulative effect of hundreds of often pragmatic decisions by various class and political actors. It took some time for the full scope and consequences of the shift to take shape and be thoroughly understood even by those who drove it forward. Thus the young revolutionary movement experienced the 1970s not as a single comprehensive package that cast doubt on its basic framework, but as a series of seemingly piecemeal difficulties, a new tactical dilemma facing the Black liberation movement, an unexpected twist on the trade union front, and the like. Inevitably, this meant that responses were uneven. Different groups saw things differently depending on where they were located geographically or sectorally, or which union most of their cadre worked within. Issues that seemed trivial in hindsight loomed large, while fundamental economic or political trends that today receive tremendous attention were addressed superficially or belatedly and sometimes not at all. The abrupt changes in position, bitter disputes, and organizational splits that inevitably flowed from this pattern were dizzying, and by the end of the decade had taken a tremendous toll, but they constituted the day-to-day process by which the movement's decline unfolded after the mid-1970s. Thus the 4 chapters that make up this section, while trying to situate what occurred in its broader socio-economic context, also attempt to dissect how these challenges were perceived and fought out at the time. A moment of optimism. At the beginning of this process, in 1972 to 1973, new communist partisans thought their prospects were bright. To take the next step in their drive for effective organization and broad political influence, the movement's central players took steps toward organizing a unified founding Congress. The Guardian's 1973 Forum series was the most public effort to bring different organizations together, though it was not based on a worked-out party-building plan. The Guardian's evaluation of the new stage it claimed had been reached was upbeat. The forces involved are moving with modesty, patience, hard work, and have a clear-cut commitment to a fraternal effort aimed at building a new communist party. The paper did not mention some of the tensions just beneath the surface. It had not been easy to negotiate agreement on precisely who would speak at the main forum. While the October League Black Workers' Congress and the Guardian sent their top leaders to the platform, the Revolutionary Union fielded an individual lower in rank than Chair Bobovikian. RU was offended because, as the largest group, it felt it deserved top billing instead of being projected as one organization among equals. In fact, the RU was already spearheading a more developed organizational effort called the National Liaison Committee, NLC. The NLC had been formed in July 1972 by representatives of the RU, IWK, BWC, and PRRWO at the New York meeting where the Young Lords Party changed its name to the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization. Not a public organization, the NLC was designed to serve as vehicle for discussions and common work aimed at uniting the participant groups. RU was the NLC's driving force. It had functioned as a Marxist-Leninist group longer than the other organizations, had a clearer strategy, and believed itself to be the key nucleus of the future new Communist Party. The Communist League initiated a rival effort. In 1972, it joined with several small collectives to call for a conference of North American Marxist-Leninists. The gathering, held in May 1973, set up a National Continuations Committee, NCC, mandated to thrash out a party program and begin organizing for a founding Congress. While attracting support in California and Detroit, CL's main areas of strength, through most of 1973 the NCC was consigned to a relatively small corner of the movement. Partly this was because of CL's obsession with praising Stalin, and partly it was due to CL's stress on theoretical discussion and internal consolidation to the virtual exclusion of mass organizing. While these positions would later gain more adherents, at this point they struck most young Marxist-Leninists as off-base and dogmatic. In any case, the constellation of forces in and around the Guardian, RUOL, IWK, BWC, and PRRWO was stronger, commanded a much larger propaganda apparatus, and at least in 1972 to 1973 seemed to be working in relative harmony. The complexities of black liberation trigger conflict, appearances were deceptive, and what the Guardian had called a fraternal effort soon fractured. The trigger of this first major blow to the movement's forward motion was bitter controversy over racism and how to fight it. Conflict was especially sharp over how to analyze and combat the special oppression of African Americans. Once groups probed beneath broad generalities, black liberation proved a tremendously complicated and multi-level issue. One level concerned matters of historical analysis and doctrine, a second revolved around immediate mass struggles and how to intervene within them. On a third level, there were assessments to be made about what attitude to take toward black nationalist groups and initiatives. And finally, there were the complex dynamics of forging solidarity and organizational unity between communists from different racial backgrounds. All these levels were interrelated, of course, but not in a simple way. Even though many Marxist-Leninists believed, for example, that everything flowed from holding a correct position on whether or not African Americans constituted a distinct nation, in practice groups that agreed on this point frequently were at loggerheads in day-to-day struggles. Meanwhile, organizations with widely differing views on the existence of a black nation often implemented nearly identical policies in practical campaigns and internal struggles. As a result, a complex and bitter series of battles raged within the movement during 1973 to 1974. Because of the RU's pace-setting role, that organization's policies were the main object of controversy. On the doctrinal level, the RU came under fire after publishing a comprehensive position on black liberation in Red Papers 5 in 1972. This ambitious document defended the Comintern CPU essay thesis of the 1930s that black people had been forged into a semi-colonized nation, held in semi-feudal bondage in the Black Belt South after the reversal of post-Civil War Reconstruction. But the RU went on to argue that since then the situation had been transformed. Black people today are not mainly rural farmers and farm laborers, but even in the South, overwhelmingly urban workers in the Black Belt. The black population, while not decreasing in absolute numbers, is decreasing relative to the number of whites. RU concluded that this had transformed African Americans into a nation of a new type, and that black people's right of self-determination, while it still must be upheld, is no longer at the heart of the black liberation struggle. These assertions were striking departures from handed-down anti-revisionist orthodoxy, and to many resembled the arguments put forward by the CPUSA when that organization abandoned the Black Nation thesis in the 1950s. This parallel was drawn by other movement groups who launched a wave of polemics against RU's position. RU responded aggressively. Today the Black nation is overwhelmingly working class. The black workers, South and North, are members of a single U.S. working class. Those who try to ignore or distort this in order to cling to an analysis that correctly or partially reflected reality in 1880 or 1930, but not reality in the 1970s, violate the Marxist-Leninist method, which Stalin himself repeatedly emphasizes. Simultaneously, conflict was breaking out over how RU was handling relations within the National Liaison Committee. IWK, BWC, and PRRWO began to criticize the predominantly white RU for trying to submerge people of color groups in a merger process destined to produce a white-dominated party. RU responded with attacks on its erstwhile partners for narrow nationalism, arguing that while racism was the main problem within the broad working-class movement, within the new communist movement itself nationalist separatism was a greater danger. These disputes led to the breakup of the NLC. IWK quit in the fall of 1973, BWC and PRRWO along with a number of dissident RU members including leading African-American cadre, left in 1974. As these groups broke away, they wrote publicly about the struggles within the NLC, which until then had been hidden from most of the movement. The Boston busing crisis. Even more controversial were changes in the RU's approach to practical struggles. Beginning in 1973, other movement cadre observed that the RU was shifting away from its earlier emphasis on specifically anti-racist demands and was downplaying the problem of racial prejudices among white workers in trying to build working-class unity. Matters came to a head in fall 1974 when the RU and every other Marxist-Leninist was confronted with a watershed battle in the early 1970s fight against racism. The sustained series of confrontations that became known nationwide as the Boston busing crisis. The crisis had been brewing for a long time. Beginning in the early 1960s, civil rights activists had challenged Boston's entrenched school segregation and the systematic underfunding and overcrowding in predominantly black schools. The drive for equality was resisted by powerful local politicians, almost all Democrats, who controlled the Boston School Committee. These figures held the reins of an extensive patronage apparatus, one of whose pillars was white supremacy. Through that apparatus they maintained a strong base in Boston's white working class. Every time conflict threatened to explode into sustained mass action, the establishment liberals who dominated statewide Massachusetts politics, again Democrats, kept trying to work out compromises that would pacify the black community without taking away the privileges of local whites. Liberal maneuvers managed to keep the lid on through the early 1970s. But irreconcilable interests could not be reconciled forever. The doors to confrontation in the streets were opened June 21, 1974 when federal Judge W. Arthur Garrity, following precedents set in other school desegregation cases, ruled that the Boston School Committee must take steps to end discrimination and segregation. Busing children to end racial imbalance was to be the main means for achieving this. But the particular busing plan to be utilized, with Garrity's approval, was seriously flawed, not least because it focused on busing students of color and did not require busing of whites. Nevertheless, the decision was bitterly opposed by the white defenders of segregation. There were also many hesitations about the plan within the black community. Advocates of community control as a better strategy than integration to achieve equality were concerned that busing would break up concentrations of black students and dilute the social base of struggles for more African American teachers and administrators, courses in black history, and so on. Similar hesitations existed within Boston's smaller Latino and Asian American communities. During the summer of 1974, white anti-desegregation activists began to organize an openly racist anti-busing movement complete with threats of violence against black children and blacks generally. As this racist movement developed, sentiment within the black community shifted. The most extensive analysis of the crisis produced by a new communist group, It's Not the Busing and the Democratic Struggle in Boston, 1974 to 1975 by the Proletarian Unity League, put it this way: What at first appeared to many as a question of education and the relative merits of integration versus community control now stood revealed in its true light: the emancipation of the oppressed nationalities and working-class democracy. As the reformist Jesse Jackson said, "It's not the bus, it's US." The issue became the democratic right to attend school in every part of the city versus the white right to segregated education. Mass demonstrations and confrontations began in early September. After school opened, Boston faced white boycotts and violence against black students. Extensive organizing went on within the African American community, as well as among Latinos and Asians, to keep the schools open, defend children of color, and resist racist beatings, shootings, and at least one attempted lynching. Between September and December, the confrontations in Boston were the focus of nationwide attention. While some Boston whites joined the fight for safe, desegregated, and equal education, much larger numbers, including large numbers of white workers, stood on the sidelines or actively defended segregation. Meanwhile, Massachusetts liberal power brokers refused to provide adequate police protection to students of color and maneuvered in concert with the open segregationists to shape the contours of the next stages of the busing program to the disadvantage of the Black, Latino, and Asian communities. The battle raged through many twists and turns for more than another year. By 1975 to 1976, the naked segregation that had existed in Boston's schools before 1974 had ended, but the particular pattern of busing utilized to achieve a measure of desegregation remained discriminatory, and the political forces that had most aggressively promoted racism had lost some but by no means all of their power, patronage, and mass base. Divisions within the left. Marxist-Leninists and others on the left were active at just about every stage of the Boston busing crisis, but they were badly divided about how to analyze the situation and what actions to take. The following analysis, excerpted from an influential editorial in the Boston-based Radical America, characterizes the most widely held perspective. The issue is racism, and it is wrong to shift the debate away from it at this time. To argue now about the educational value of busing or of community-controlled schools versus integrated schools would be to equivocate. It is wrong to avoid the issue by arguing about the merits of various hypothetical alternatives. Alternatives to the current busing plans do not exist for most black parents in Boston. While we do not call for integration, we do oppose forced exclusion and segregation of blacks and other minorities. We support their right to integration either as a goal or as a tactic to secure equality. It is also wrong to avoid the issue by emphasizing the poor quality of white schools in Boston. However poor their quality, there has been an organized racist attempt to attack black children attending these schools. While the serious problems with this particular busing plan are the fault of the court and the obstructionist school committee, we think it is wrong to see busing as a ruling class plot. The achievement of busing is in fact the result of a long struggle Boston blacks have waged against segregation. We oppose those left groups that attack the plan because it seems to be dividing workers at the present time. Most black people in Boston, whatever their initial assessments of the busing plan, now support busing as one way of achieving better education for their children. To waver on the issue of busing is to play into the hands of those racists who know that the defeat of busing would greatly strengthen the racist status quo. A black victory will be a working class victory. As black people demand and achieve democratic rights and equality, they are transforming the structure of the working class. In doing so, they narrow the differences between blacks and whites, erode the material base of racism, and create greater opportunity for class unity. In this sense, we see this black demand for equality as a class demand. But this was hardly the only view. The left was divided not just on details, but on central analytic and strategic points, and so was the new communist movement. It's Not the Bus describes the left as being separated into three broad camps. The first is dubbed the conciliators of liberalism, who generally ignored, downplayed, or liquidated the necessity to expose the role of the liberal bourgeoisie and the assimilationist forces, the NAACP. The far-left posture of the Marxist-Leninist current meant that no any revisionist groups were placed in this camp, in which It's Not the Bus placed many unaffiliated leftists as well as the CPUSA and SWP. The second category, which is termed the proletarian struggle camp, was composed of groups that generally opposed the busing plan, directing their main fire at the liberals and the assimilationists. They saw the task as constructing a wholly new, wholly pure proletarian camp, free from the influence of liberals and assimilationists. Under these circumstances, some of the groups ended up conciliating with the anti-busing movement. This set of groups was said to include the Revolutionary Union and Workers' Viewpoint, as well as the Puerto Rican Socialist Party and the African Liberation Support Committee. Finally, the third camp was composed of forces who at times emphasis in original were able to strike a correct balance between the tasks of opposing the anti-busing movement and struggling with misleaders within the democratic movement. In this group, PUL placed the OL, BWC, CL, and some smaller collectives including itself. Even among the organizations that shared what PUL and this author considered to be a generally correct view, the lines of these different groups were neither consistent nor unified. None of these groups were able to unite the left during the course of the struggle, even for individual actions. With the eyes of the country on Boston, more than one group proclaimed this complex battle a key test for everyone on the left. The failure of the anti-revisionists to provide effective leadership was an extremely serious blow to the movement. Up through 1973, the new communist movement's dedication to anti-racism and the strength of its track record in political practice had been one of its strongest attractions. But now the movement was divided over the basic issue of whether the Boston battle was mainly a fight against racism or a confrontation with a ruling class plot to use busing to divide workers. And even those organizations with a sound basic stance were unable to unite on a common program of action. The biggest sign that the movement had started to founder was that its flagship organization, the Revolutionary Union, had gone furthest off track. More than just about any other left group, the RU directed its fire against busing and relegated the issue of racism to the background. The result was consistent conciliation, bordering on alliance, with the segregationist backlash. The screaming front-page headline "People Must Unite to Smash Boston Busing Plan" in the October 1974 issue of RU's newspaper crystallized the group's blunder. The issue was published at the same time as the most aggressive advocates of smashing the busing plan were physically attacking Boston blacks on sight, and more than one Bostonian thought on first glance that the RU publication was a right-wing tabloid. This was quite a turnaround for the group that had made criticism of progressive labor's conciliation of racism because of its attacks on the Panthers a cornerstone in launching the new communist movement back in 1968 to 1969. Since this fight was not limited to doctrinal polemics but involved cadre taking directly opposite positions in a heated confrontation, tensions between the RU and its opponents reached new heights. The RU dug in its heels, but for the first time faced not just criticism but near complete isolation. Years later, both factions of the then split RU would issue re-evaluations acknowledging that they had been wrong in not seeing racism as the centerpiece of the Boston conflict. But the left's map had changed so much by then that these self-criticisms were hardly noticed. Intersection with party-building plans. RU's reversal of its late 1960s stance on the centrality of the anti-racist struggle was interrelated with other policy shifts. In particular, it was connected to RU's accelerating its effort to convene a founding party congress. In May 1974, after the NLC broke up but before the Boston busing crisis exploded, the RU declared that the central task was no longer building the struggle, consciousness, and revolutionary unity of the working class, because communists had supposedly secured a foothold in the proletariat and experience had clarified all key political questions. Conditions were ripe for uniting genuine revolutionaries behind a correct program, and party building was now the central task. The decision to move quickly toward a founding Congress was necessarily accompanied by an aggressive expansion campaign, and also by a more combative posture toward groups unwilling to go along. A fundamental premise of anti-revisionism was that only one vanguard could exist in any country. In a pre-party period, it was possible to concede that several groups with different perspectives could be building blocks of a party to be. But once RU or any other group moved to stake a claim to the title of vanguard, logic dictated that organizations that refused to join up had to be exposed as opportunists. In this vein, the RU viciously criticized its former NLC partners and heaped scorn on rivals who challenged its policies in Boston. Simultaneously, the RU began to take an uncompromising go-it-alone posture in mass movements. Emphasis was placed on immediate recruitment and winning control of mass organizations rather than on developing cooperative relationships with others. The results were universally negative, and nowhere more than in Vietnam Veterans Against the War, Winter Soldier Organization (VVAW, WSO). Vietnam Veterans Against the War had peaked in influence in 1971 to 1972 following the dramatic protest when hundreds of vets threw their medals over the fence surrounding the U.S. Capitol. See Chapter 1. The organization grew to over 11,000 members, and 2 books from major publishers, The New Soldier and The Winter Soldier Investigation, put its views before the country. After the Paris peace agreements were signed in January 1973, VVW's size and activity, like that of other anti-war organizations, declined considerably, but by this time a substantial number of members had been radicalized and were eager to organize veterans and active duty GIs for a long-term struggle. In April 1973, the organization, still with upwards of 1,000 members and dozens of chapters, adopted an explicitly anti-imperialist program and added the term Winter Soldier Organization to its name, taking inspiration from Tom Paine, the pamphleteer of the 13 Colonies' original battle for independence. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands now deserves the thanks of man and woman. Simultaneously, VVWSO opened membership to non-veterans who agreed with the aims and organizing priorities of the group, especially encouraging women to join. It also began to search for a more defined strategic perspective, and the kind of political and theoretical debates that were raging in the rest of the left began to play a more prominent role in the life of the group. Many longtime VVW stalwarts were won over to the perspective of the RU, and RU members who were not Vietnam vets began to join chapters across the country. In 1974, soon after the RU's proclamation that party building had become the central task, the many-sided debates within VVWSO began to congeal into a single sharp polarization between an RU-aligned tendency and the rest of the membership. The pro-RU wing argued for putting top priority on demands for decent benefits for all veterans, a view that most other members believed marked a step back from VVW's long-standing anti-war and anti-imperialist focus. Echoing the differences that emerged during the Boston busing crisis, RU cadre and their allies were also criticized for downplaying the fight against racism and sexism. For a time, these differences were debated as VVWSO continued its organizing work. But in April 1975, the RU-controlled national office moved decisively to assert full control over the organization. It expelled a number of chapters, drove out scores of individuals, and then imposed programmatic uniformity on those members who remained. Within a very few months, VVWSO declined to a small core of RU cadre and close supporters. Many of those expelled bitterly denounced the power grab and linked it directly to RU's drive to found a party. Our struggle is directly tied to the RU calling for a founding party congress this summer. Their concept of a united front against imperialism is a key element of their theory. From their point of view, little special interest groups fighting for their own needs are seen as mass support for their party's line and revolutionary strategy. It is important to them to have a vets and GI organization in their united front. The RU would like to announce that VVWSO supports their party. The only way this can be done is if all opposition to their line is either driven or kicked out. VVWSO, once among the most prestigious popular organizations of the anti-Vietnam War movement, was now a casualty of the drive to found a vanguard. A flurry of documents pillaring RU's tactics circulated widely on the left, damaging the RU's already plummeting reputation. As a result of all this, the period in which RU set the pace for the entire new communist movement came to a bitter end. The extent of RU's decline was symbolized dramatically and comically by a literal 10-story fall. On October 11, 1974, a delegation of 50 RU members set out for a political confrontation with the Guardian staff. But they overloaded the elevator in the old New York building where the newspaper had its office. The elevator sank under the load, carrying the RU members down to the basement. The Guardian termed the RU action an attempt at physical intimidation, an evaluation widely shared throughout the left. RU was undeterred. It convened a Congress in September 1975 that formally disbanded RU and founded the Revolutionary Communist Party, RCP. This is both an act of determined dedication and a historic moment. The party of the working class has been born. Based on the impressive structure RU had built since 1968, the RCP continued to grow for several more years. It remained the single largest new communist organization and reached its height of something over 1,000 members sometime between 1975 and 1978. Outside its own milieu, however, RURCP had become a near pariah. Between fall 1974 and fall 1975, most other anti-revisionists shifted from having criticisms of RU to seeing it as virtually outside of Marxism-Leninism altogether. The Guardian wrote that the abysmal white chauvinism of RU meant the loss of virtually all credibility. Iworkian declared that formation of the RCP marked the group's final exit from the ranks of the Marxist-Leninist movement. a swing toward dogmatism and extreme leftism. Inevitably, the rest of the movement worked overtime to draw the appropriate lessons from the declension of its pioneer group. On one level, many cadre drew useful conclusions, probing the complexities of the Boston confrontations. Many activists gained deeper insight into the material basis of racism within the working class and redoubled their commitment to demands addressing the special oppression of peoples of color. Valuable warnings were also raised about the dangers of an organization trying to get its way through maneuver and bullying rather than persuasion and positive example. Calls went out for more attention to theoretical matters, as groups previously concerned mainly with proletarizing their cadre recognized that immersing activists in the working class would not by itself provide answers to knotty questions such as those thrown up by the Boston crisis. But for the most part, the response to the RU's blunders was skewed by a lurch toward ultra-leftism and dogmatism. The RU's mistakes were widely characterized as stemming from an alleged combination of rightism, that is, giving in to the pull of spontaneity, and deviating from the sacred texts of classical Marxism-Leninism. So the group's best positioned to step into the leadership vacuum, as well as numerous unaffiliated Marxist activists, concluded that a reassertion of pre-existing orthodoxy and insistence on pursuing thoroughly left policies was the key to avoiding any more RU-type debacles. On the specific issue of busing, the groups that pilloried the RU were all over the map. The OL and CL had both supported busing, while WVO had opposed it. But they and other groups all focused their criticisms on the RU's daring to tamper with the 1930s CPU-SA Comintern line postulating the existence of a black nation. The OL, CL, and WVO all had different interpretations of the original Comintern thesis. The OL believed that the black nation was made up only of the African American population in the Black Belt South, while CL postulated a Negro nation defined by its territorial boundaries and made up of both black Negroes and white Negroes living in that territory. Still, they agreed that it was RU's abandonment of the Comintern line that lay at the core of its errors. True, the old Comintern position did focus attention on the independent, that is not reducible simply to class dimension of the black struggle. In this it marked an advance over positions that had up until that time dominated the socialist left. But there were a host of problems with the black nation thesis from its inception, and many historians have made the case that the CPU-SA's exemplary anti-racist practice during the 1930s was due to its embracing only certain aspects of this thesis while ignoring others. In any case, whatever the flaws in RU's analysis of the period after the Civil War, the group was certainly correct, as the CP had been in the 1950s, in pointing out that tremendous changes had taken place in the situation of African Americans since 1928. What the Boston crisis had highlighted was the need for new theoretical analyses. While the classical communist framework had something to offer in this area, so did the alternative paradigms developed by others, including Harold Crews, James Boggs, and Robert Allen, whose 1975 book Reluctant Reformers included an insightful Marxist critique of the Black Nation framework. Likewise, the Times demanded fresh analyses of the country's changing demographics, in particular the expanding numbers and special conditions of Latinos and Asian Americans. But the particular way most anti-revisionists condemned RU pushed in a different direction. Rather than foster a willingness to look beyond the boundaries of traditional doctrine, it called upon Marxist-Leninists to embrace more firmly a position formulated 40-plus years before, and pressures toward dogmatism were not limited to this issue. Through 1974 and 1975, a mounting chorus argued that classical doctrine contained the answers to all questions, from how to analyze 1970s trade unions to understanding the evolution and current nature of the USSR. The voices arguing this outlook overwhelmed all others, and the dogmatic tendencies that had been present in the new communist movement from the beginning assumed hegemonic force. Worship of the classics became not just frequent but the norm. Intellectual censorship and self-censorship took hold, with most groups coming to see dangers of American exec-abolitionists. The idea that Marxism-Leninism didn't apply to the U.S. in virtually any fresh historical or social analysis of U.S. society. From this point on, original theoretical production within the mainstream of the new communist movement all but dried up, and only a few dissident strands, about which more later, even attempted to do more than take positions that could be easily justified via quotations from the Leninist classics, or the current positions of the Communist Party of China, miniaturized Leninism. Within this swing toward what might best be termed communist fundamentalism, the dominant critique of RU on party building had perhaps the most immediate negative effect, Critics claimed that the RU's mistakes were due primarily to its pre-1974 view that building the mass movement rather than party building was the central task. RU's initial view was attacked as being a rightist deviation that erroneously prioritized links with broad movements over ideological purification and propaganda efforts tailored to a small stratum of advanced workers. Polemics by the OL, WVO, CL, BWC, IWK, and PRRWO, as well as a short book by New Voice leader Charles Lauren, all sounded variations on this theme. They argued that immunity from the infection that supposedly corrupted RU would be gained primarily by studying the communist classics, and some of RU's critics argued that rooting out errors like those of the RU required giving top priority to studying the theory of party building itself. Conditions outside the movement also facilitated this retreat into purist orthodoxies. By 1974 to 1975, the popular movements which had surged in 1970 to 1973 had ebbed like their late 60s predecessors, leaving the entire revolutionary left adrift. Conceptions of a large and flexible organization, informed by Marxist theory but deriving its vitality from week-to-week interaction with a dynamic layer of class-conscious workers, began to appear more and more abstract. In that context, theories promoted by earlier communist generations and the prestige of parties in other countries began to carry even more weight. This was hardly the first time in communist history that narrowing opportunities for political advance had led to theoretical and strategic rigidity rather than readjustment and creativity. The side of Lenin that insisted upon breadth of vision, politics begin where millions of men and women are, where there are not thousands but millions, and tremendous political flexibility. What Eric Hobsbawm called Lenin's habitual realism was buried under endless quotations demanding doctrinal purity and iron discipline. The idea that demarcations between reformists and revolutionaries were necessary over decisive questions facing broad masses was constricted into a sectarian mandate to split over shades of doctrine important at most to a few thousand people. The proposition that the purpose of embracing revolutionary theory was to guide an organization toward earning a vanguard role was increasingly obscured. Instead, most groups began to act as if adopting a certain set of principles meant being anointed by history or given the franchise as the proletarian vanguard. The result was the rise to hegemony of a sort of Leninism in miniature. Leninist precepts were cited, but their meaning was drastically narrowed in scope and scale. 60-year-old polemics written as guidelines for a party of thousands to interact with a movement of millions were interpreted through the prism of how organizations of hundreds or even dozens should interact with movements of thousands or less. The tendency toward mechanical formulas and organizational narrow-mindedness went from having a certain influence to becoming deeply entrenched. The movement's vision of a vanguard party was reduced to the model of a sect. Just when a dose of fresh thinking was needed to transcend the limits of the Stalin-Mao model and expand on the valuable insights in Lenin's thought, the movement's strongest groups headed in the exact opposite direction. Miniaturized Leninism was Leninist in form, but sterile in content, a changed organizational map. These ideological shifts and the RU's decline drew the movement's organizational map. Beginning at the end of 1973, the Communist League and the National Continuations Committee it led enjoyed a notable rise in influence. The CL and other NCC groups had for some time been the harshest critics of the RU's position that party building was not yet the central task. They argued for putting a priority on study and declared that RU and other rivals had failed to sufficiently repudiate their new left heritage, counterposing CL's own continuity with the pre-1956 communist movement. As the RU foundered, these positions gained a wider hearing. PRRWO, BWC and the August 29 movement all joined the NCC, though each left after only a few months. Their brief participation heightened the NCC's credibility. The NCC's temporary growth spurt also negatively affected RU. Fear that the Communist League would beat it in the race to hold a founding Congress figured in RU's decision to accelerate its own Congress preparations and exacerbated RU's sectarian trajectory. The Communist League still managed to convene its Congress first, launching the Communist Labor Party of the United States of North America, CLP, in September 1974. The new group was smaller than RU, but had managed to consolidate a core of several hundred, perhaps close to 1,000 members. It launched a twice-monthly but only 4- to 8-page newspaper, the People's Tribune, with a separate Spanish edition, Tribuno Popular. The newly formed party immediately turned away from most interaction with other self-identified anti-revisionists, whom it regarded as hopelessly petty bourgeois. to concentrate on sinking its cadre into unions and people of color communities. Other Marxist-Leninists returned the CLP's disdain. They attacked CLP for its elevation of Stalin over Mao in the communist pantheon and for daring to criticize the Chinese as well as the Soviet Party for nationalism and opportunism. They condemned and often ridiculed CLP's theory of a Negro nation in the South that included both blacks and whites. Though CLP was organizationally isolated by the end of 1974, it had contributed a good deal to the fundamentalist dissent. Most of its specific political positions were rejected, but its call to focus theoretical efforts on the classics and its dismissive attitude toward most 1960s movements had a continuing influence. The October League swings leftwards. Within the movement's mainstream, the October League was best positioned to assume RU's pace-setting role. OL had slowly but steadily developed its organizing work through 1973 and 1974. It had developed an informal arrangement with The Guardian whereby the paper placed OL operatives in staff posts as a counterweight to a perceived takeover threat from RU. In general, OL had much better relations with other movement activists in 1973 to 1974 than either RU or CLCLP. But just when it was moving center stage, OL itself, partly in reaction to RU's alleged rightism, turned toward extremely left and sectarian policies. On the crucial trade union front, in 1976, OL completely reversed its earlier positive attitude toward steelworkers reform leader Ed Sadlowski, who was bidding for the presidency of what was then the AFL-CIO's largest union, with 1 million members. Sadlowski's campaign grew out of a militant rank-and-file movement, and he was challenging his opponent's support for restrictions on workers' right to strike. But OL declared that bureaucrats like Sadlowski come forward as the main scabs and slickest defenders of the system and denounced his bid as a trick by the bourgeoisie to channel the revolutionary aspirations and strivings of the masses into reformism. Sadlowski lost the election, though he did gain 44% of the vote and carried a majority of workers in the largest steel plants. Simultaneously, OL's tactics and mass organizations began to resemble the RU's power grab within Viva WSO. In 1974 and 1975, OL cadre began to concentrate in the Southern Conference Educational Fund, SEF, a progressive Southern organization that had a history of courageous organizing against racism stretching back to its founding in 1938. Through the 1950s and 1960s, SEF included activists with different ideological viewpoints, and several key SEF activists were members or sympathizers of the CPUSA. But after OL took over SEF in 1975, it completely undermined the organization's united front character. At a SEF board meeting in 1976, OL cadre pushed through a resolution terming the USSR a social imperialist superpower. Though SEF had never previously taken these kinds of ideological positions, the call then bragged that the CP was driven out of SEF. The drive for organizational control and ideological uniformity gutted SEF's base, and the circulation of its newspaper fell by 80%. One of the bitterest ironies of this fiasco was that the key October League member involved, Bob Zellner, had been a core activist in the uplifting and unitary days of the civil rights movement. Zellner had been one of the first white activists in SNCC, where his courage won tremendous respect. He was initially added to the SNCC staff as a field secretary mandated to recruit anti-racist Southern whites into the struggle, a post established via an agreement between SNCC and SEF, with SEF providing the funds. At the core of these damaging policies was OL's enthusiasm for one of the Chinese Communist Party's latest mandates: no united action with revisionism. This formula meant that OL would boycott coalitions within which CPUSA members played a significant role. This meant either pursuing rule or ruin, or rule and ruin, policies such as those undertaken within SEF, or more commonly, straining ties with independent-minded activists who were unwilling to sit out important struggles simply because the CPUSA was also involved. Simultaneously, OL launched a theoretical journal to carry its first at-length volleys on the theoretical front, which all defended fundamentalist positions. The group also published for a revolutionary position on the Negro question, Carrie Haywood's defense of the Black Nation thesis, originally written as a polemic within the CPUSA in 1957. OL's turn led to growing tensions with The Guardian, and in spring 1975 came a bitter public break. OL attacked The Guardian for covering up for revisionism in the social imperialist Soviet Union and directed its members and sympathizers on the newspaper's staff to resign. believing that it had replaced the RU as the pace-setting Marxist-Leninist group and convinced that its fealty to CPC positions gave it an unbeatable trump card. OL took the path trod earlier by RU and CL and began preparations for a founding Congress. It set up new mass organizations under its control, founding the Communist Youth Organization and the National Fightback Organization, which drew 1,100 people to Chicago for its founding meeting and high point. In December 1975, it transformed the call from a monthly to a weekly beginning January 1, 1976. BWC breaks up and the Revolutionary Wing forms. This same year saw the breakup of the Black Workers' Congress, ending the life of a group that had originated out of the most sustained radical workers' upsurge of the late 1960s, early 1970s. Though BWC had been in difficulties for some time, its final collapse amid extremely bitter doctrinal and personal disputes was still a serious blow to the entire movement. In the end, BWC fractured into 4 tiny splinters, all espousing one or another variety of extreme left policies and anti-revisionist orthodoxy, though recognizing the BWC breakup as a setback, especially within the Black liberation movement. Anti-revisionists took heart from the conversion of Amiri Baraka and the Congress of African Peoples to Marxism-Leninism. They were also encouraged by the public surfacing in late 1974 of the Revolutionary Workers' League, which included most of the core leadership of the African Liberation Support Committee. These developments seemed to augur a new level of influence for Marxism-Leninism among African American activists, but it soon became clear that the actual results would be much more mixed, due to the dogmatic and sectarian positions adopted by the two groups, especially RWL. Having decided that building a proletarian vanguard was the key task, RWL began to shift its cadre into factory work and to insist that discussions of party building be injected into ALSE and all other popular organizations. This stance was a prime factor in destroying ALSE's United Front character, as the group became an uncomfortable place for activists interested in solidarity work but not in debates over how to build a new communist party. By late 1975, the most important broad-based and activist formation in the Black movement between 1972 and 1974 was all but defunct. Also at the end of 1975, the RWL aligned itself with a now shrunken PRWO to form the self-proclaimed Revolutionary Wing, which briefly included the August 29th movement and Workers' Viewpoint as well. The wing, its shorthand self-designation, attacked everyone else for being insufficiently anti-revisionist and for focusing on mass work instead of doctrinal purification campaigns. Lasting only a few months, this tendency broke up in a flurry of bitter polemics in the spring of 1976. The PRRWO and RWL remained allied for a time before collapsing altogether amid purges, reports of violence and physical intimidation against ex-members, and charges that various individuals were police agents. A team, though battered by the experience, managed to extricate itself before the worst name-calling and thuggery occurred. Only Workers' Viewpoint organization emerged somewhat strengthened from the ordeal, though advocating ideological purity as fiercely as its former allies. WVO did not completely withdraw from mass activity. In 1974, WVO cadre initiated Asian Americans for Equal Employment, AFE, in New York City, which quickly scored a major success. AFE led a militant mass struggle which forced a recalcitrant contractor to hire 24 Chinese American workers for a large Chinatown construction project, Confucius Plaza. Then in 1975, AFE played a point role in battles against police abuse following the beating of a Chinese-American engineer by New York City officers. WVO then conducted forums around the country to promote its achievements and expand its ranks. Its biggest breakthrough came when it recruited several key cadre out of the rapidly degenerating RWL, including former YWU chair Nelson Johnson. This gave the group a base in the South to add to its East Coast core and foothold in California, and added several experienced African Americans to its until then predominantly Asian American leadership. While still smaller than OL, by 1976 WVO had established itself as a pole that drew energy from and in turn strengthened the swing toward ultra-left policies and dogmatic reassertions of orthodoxy. Pockets of resistance. Some circles resisted the swing toward left purism. The Guardian continued to advocate flexible tactics in mass movements and criticized no united action with revisionism as a recipe for marginalization. On party building, it rejected the idea of focusing narrowly on internal movement debate and continued to call for a cooperative effort among wide sectors of the movement. It was more willing than any other movement institution with nationwide influence to express reservations about the emphasis on orthodoxy. whether of the Stalinist or CPC varieties, but it too was affected by the general drift. The paper's most ardent defense of Chinese foreign policy came in 1973 to 1975, despite growing signs that the CPC was moving away from focusing on the fight against U.S. imperialism, and a lengthy series in the paper on Trotskyism by Carl Davidson, subsequently published as a Guardian pamphlet, reprised a one-sided Stalinist version of communist history. At the local level, several smaller collectives were also uncomfortable with the direction being taken by the largest groups. PL's It's Not the Bus pamphlet presented a no-nonsense critique of ultra-leftism and sectarianism, a harbinger of more elaborate analyses to come. The Philadelphia Workers' Organizing Committee, which had grown large enough to launch a newspaper, The Organizer, in January 1975, offered a somewhat different critique of dogmatism and ultra-left errors. The leaderships of Elbaum and Mao and Che, which completed its transformation into a Marxist-Leninist group in January 1975, and of the Union of Democratic Filipinos, KDP, expressed similar sentiments. There was a general restiveness among many cadre who had not joined one of the larger pre-party groups, and in some cities new Marxist-Leninist collectives came together on the basis of opposition to sectarianism and ultra-leftism, though generally not to the idea that there was one orthodox Marxism-Leninism that embodied all fundamental truths. Challenges were also mounted on a few specific hot-button issues. Critique of the Black Nation Thesis, a 1975 pamphlet whose authors included leaders of the KDP and Third World Women's Alliance, criticized the national question framework as inadequate to address the complexities and particularities of Black oppression. The pamphlet called for a focus on racism as both material reality and ideology, and emphasized the socially constructed nature of U.S. racial categories, foreshadowing approaches that would become prevalent on the left in the 1980s and 1990s. Several 1975 initiatives also challenged communist homophobia. Toward a scientific analysis of the gay question, by a group of 10 communists who are gay women, contributed a scathing critique of RU's backward theory that homosexuality constituted a decadent and individualistic response to decaying capitalism that would disappear under socialism. Useful as all these pockets of resistance were, however, they remained too scattered to take the initiative away from the trend toward ultra-leftism. Growth continues despite obstacles. The RU debacle, growing fragmentation, and the swing toward dogmatism combined to check the new communist movement's ascent within the left. But even though its momentum was slowed, through 1975 and 1976 Marxism-Leninism continued to gain influence and recruits. Most movement activists, even as they grew more hostile to former allies, still considered themselves part of a trend on the rise. Activists in other parts of the left grudgingly shared this view. A prime reason was that, taken individually, the largest anti-revisionist organizations continued to expand their numbers and the scope of the work. The RURCP, and CLCLP were reaping the benefits of the years each had invested in consolidating a sophisticated nationwide apparatus. It had naturally taken some time for their cadre across the country to become adept at functioning with a common style and discipline, and to set up newspapers, journals, and literature distribution systems. By 1974 to 1975, even though the honeymoon years of cooperation were over, the capacities of such apparatuses were only beginning to be tapped. With a sophisticated organization and several hundred skilled cadre, it was possible to make headway even with a flawed and sectarian strategy. And despite the ebb in mass political activity compared to the late 1960s and early 1970s, a lively protest movement still existed. So did discontent among young workers of all colors who had been exposed to radical ideas. Thus, at least on the scale of growing by a few dozen or even a few hundred people a year, or getting a campaign underway in a particular union, it was not just possible but common for the larger groups to score gains. On this scale, the negative impact of left infighting was overshadowed by the immediate organizing capacities of a tight-knit cadre group, even a local collective of just a dozen or 24 people. More important, events in world and national politics continued to push those individuals who did become radicalized in the direction of Marxism-Leninism. The bloody U.S.-sponsored 1973 coup in Chile had a huge impact. In 1970, Salvador Allende had led a coalition of left parties and won the presidency in a democratic election. Between his election and the coup, there was widespread debate on the left in Chile and worldwide about what steps should or could be taken to build popular power and ward off Chile's CIA-backed right wing. When Allende was ousted and killed, the entire revolutionary left, as well as far broader circles, concluded that his key error lay in failing to move decisively against the counter-revolutionary core in the army, police, and right-wing groups. The Chilean events seemed bloody confirmation of Leninism's argument that socialist transformation required smashing the bourgeois state apparatus and establishing a dictatorship of the proletariat. Soviet and social democratic speculations about peaceful transitions to socialism lost credibility in favor of anti-revisionist insistence on armed revolution. The continuing gains of armed movements elsewhere in the Third World reinforced this motion. Vietnam remained the central reference point. Despite U.S. and South Vietnamese government violations of the 1973 peace agreements, the revolutionaries grew strong enough to launch a final offensive in the spring of 1975. Washington was helpless to stop the disintegration of its puppet army, and on April 30, 1975, the entire world watched the spectacle of those last crowded helicopters taking off from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Washington's client governments in Cambodia and Laos were also ousted, on April 17 and May 9 respectively, and the victory of communist-led insurgents in Southeast Asia was complete. During 1974 and 1975, the Maoist-led insurgency in the Philippines also advanced. In February 1974, 4 groups of Latin America's armed left, Uruguay's Tupamaros, Bolivia's National Liberation Army, the MIR in Chile, and the People's Revolutionary Army of Argentina, announced the formation of a joint revolutionary council. In April 1974, the strength of the armed movements in Portugal's African colonies reverberated within Portugal itself. The fascist government was overthrown by a left-inclined armed forces movement whose members had been influenced by the very revolutionary organizations they had been fighting against. Indeed, the entire Third World seemed on the move. The fourth summit of the non-aligned movement held in Algiers in September 1973 was the largest yet, with 75 participating nations. Fidel Castro and others from the most radical wing of the movement played pivotal roles in formulating the summit's famous proposal for a new international economic order. With the non-aligned movement pressing the matter, the UN General Assembly voted to adopt this proposal as official policy, and also voted overwhelmingly to reaffirm the inalienable right of the Puerto Rican people to self-determination and independence. In September 1974, the Ethiopian regime of Emperor Haile Selassie, the largest recipient of U.S. military aid in sub-Saharan Africa, was overthrown by a military council, the Derg, which declared itself the leader of a socialist revolution. In November 1974, PLO chair Yasser Arafat was invited to open the UN debate on Palestine, and the General Assembly voted 106-4 to recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. In June 1974, the Sixth Pan-African Congress, the largest ever and the first held since 1945, was held in Tanzania, with a radical anti-imperialist perspective shaping the proceedings. The African American delegation was the largest contingent at the Congress. Under the circumstances, the trend on the U.S. left most strongly identified with Third World anti-imperialism, and Marxist-led armed movements inevitably continued to attract support. More than any other single indicator, the circulation of The Guardian told the tale. Through 1972 and 1973, the paper's circulation rose slowly but steadily from its dip after the liberated Guardian breakaway and the collapse of sixties. And then in 1974, the paper picked up over 1,500 new subscribers to cross back above 20,000, where it stayed for several years. Monthly Review, not linked to the new communist movement but like The Guardian enthusiastic about Third World struggles in China, also peaked in circulation between 1975 and 1977, at a little over 11,000. The contradictory impacts of energy crisis and recession. Another crucial factor was the energy crisis of 1973 to 1974, followed by the recession of 1974 to 1975. This slump was the worst economic downturn in the U.S. since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The drop in the GNP in the last quarter of 1974 was the steepest of any quarter in 16 years, and official unemployment rates reached their highest point since the 1930s. Contrary to the expectations of many on the left, however, this downturn did not produce an outpouring of worker militancy or a large-scale radicalization. To the contrary, it played a role that recessions have often played in the history of capitalism, disciplining the working class, exacerbating intra-class divisions, and narrowing many workers' vision to issues of immediate survival. In the concrete, the 1974 to 1975 slump scared most of the trade union leadership, leading many officials to seek new levels of accommodation with capital in order to save jobs. It led to massive layoffs in key industries such as auto and steel, and those expelled from the plants included a disproportionate share of those workers most open to radical ideas, young workers and especially young black workers. Under these conditions, the rank-and-file insurgencies that had spread widely in numerous unions between 1968 and 1972 lost momentum or shriveled up altogether, with the notable exception of those among the United Mine Workers and Teamsters. In addition, the government media campaign to blame the slump on the Arab countries fueled jingoism and national chauvinism among broad layers of the population. While the energy crisis was in fact a product of market manipulation by US and European-based oil transnationals, and underneath that the underlying structure of the capitalist energy industry, it was convenient for the U.S. establishment to target the 8 Arab oil-producing countries that had raised prices and briefly conducted a selective oil embargo against the U.S., South Africa and other countries that had backed Israel in the October 1973 Middle East War. Iran, then a supporter of Israel, deruled by the Shah, also endorsed a price hike for economic reasons and to obtain funds to purchase additional Western weapons. Abuse was heaped on the Arabs and Third World radicals generally, and it tapped into the generalized resentment millions felt at what they believed to be the humiliation of the U.S. in Vietnam and elsewhere in Asia and Africa, the Middle East and Latin America. In these ways and more, the economic shocks of 1973 to 1975 played a crucial role in the general 1970s rightward shift in U.S. politics, but trapped in their ultra-left and dogmatic frameworks, most Marxist-Leninists missed the paramount features of this important episode. They focused instead on the very depth and severity of the crisis and the fact that at least some part in it was played by an expression of militancy by Third World Arab countries, concluding that indeed the Third World was growing in strength and could severely limit the reach of Washington. In this, the Marxist-Leninists were hardly alone. Mainstream analyst Kevin Phillips spoke for many of capitalism's defenders when he worried aloud in 1975 that the tides of history are flowing dangerously against the U.S. The U.S., like all previous empires, has begun to decline. Likewise, the newly formed Club of Rome, a global think tank bringing together heads of state, former heads of state, high-level civil servants and leading establishment intellectuals, began issuing reports with titles like The Limits to Growth, which painted a dire picture of the future of modern industrial red capitalist society. More generally, the combination of economic stagnation with seemingly intractable inflation seemed proof that 1970s monopoly capitalism was beset by deep-rooted instabilities. Again, this view was not completely wrong-headed. 2 decades later, the proposition that 1973 to 1975 marked an economic turning point has become widely accepted from left to right. Following this end of the great post-World War II boom was a restructuring of world capitalism, and with it many changes in the relationships between its component institutions, nations, and classes. The new communist movement, and many others on the left, were badly off base in their early 1970s projections of what those shifts would be. Yet the left did accurately perceive that big changes were afoot, and that these would include a sharper confrontation between a wounded imperialist power trying to regain its previous positions and bitter opponents at home and abroad. In the very short term, the prevalence of this perception strengthened the new communist movement. It buttressed the 1905 to 1917 analogy and commitment to party building. And for activists in their general orbit, it gave credibility to the orthodox Leninist claim that capitalism had reached the point of irreversible decline. China's prestige. Finally, during 1974 and 1975, Mao and China still enjoyed great prestige among broad layers of the intelligentsia. Praise for Beijing as a beacon of progress and democracy came from figures far beyond the Marxist-Leninist ranks. Here, for instance, are excerpts from an article reporting on the Chinese campaign to criticize Lin Biao and Confucius written by women's movement and healthcare activist Barbara Ehrenreich. Well before the current movement, Chinese women were already vastly more liberated than we are in the U.S. Daycare is universally available and practically free. Women are encouraged to enter all but the most strenuous occupations. The disappearance of the Little Red Book is by no means a repudiation of Mao's thought, quite the opposite. The Red Book was a shortcut to Mao Zedong thought. Today there are no shortcuts. In the movement to criticize Lin Biao and Confucius, everyone is urged to read the basic texts of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought for themselves. Peasants, formerly illiterate old people, young students, workers are reading and discussing the critique of the Gotha program, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. The movement is what the Chinese say it is, part of a continuing effort to unleash the activity of the masses, to create people of wisdom. One can only speculate about what Ehrenreich, now one of the left's most prominent intellectuals and a member of DSA, would say about such an evaluation today. But at the time she was convinced enough to include further praise of Chinese communist policies in her keynote address at the first-ever National Conference on Socialist Feminism in 1975. She was hardly an isolated case, and such sentiments necessarily accrued to the advantage of the anti-revisionist movement, but it was the prestige of the Communist Party of China that was about to plummet as the CPC switched sides in the international class struggle.